Travis clap. Together.
Yeah, I thought we're not supposed to do it together so we can sync our individual stuff.
Right, because it's impossible for us to do anything at the same time.
Yes, that is. Yes, famously a Zoom problem.
That's a good point. Yeah,
that's a great segue into this album.
Right,
it's actually true. Yeah, now that we live in this sort of aleatoric world. Well, I was sort of interested in, I guess, the overall sort of conceptual approach, which feels very explicitly sort of, I don't know, like doing this music is some sort of form of self-care, which is actually an interesting idea to me because it's such a sort of cliche to say like, oh, you know, the arts are important because they give us comfort or whatever. But, you know, I do think there's an aspect of truth to that. And I guess I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts on like creating something that was very explicitly designed with that in mind.
I can start with that because, yeah, there's a lot of places that was coming from. One was the idea that like it's both a cliche and sort of, but it's also kind of it feels like vulgar to say that music is functional in any meaningful sense, like that calming whatever, like music as a functional way to heal the body and so whatever is like, at least in the classical music world where we come from, it's okay if it's a byproduct of the process, but it feels like it's Muzak or somehow lesser if it is part of the foundational or even just part of the conversation in the why something is created. So
because it feels somehow more like it's a lower goal somehow, or
yeah,
what?
Absolutely, like commercial or like accessible or like is yeah, all the things, like all the reasons why it's sort of dirty to call something accessible. It's
dirty
also
word.
Absolutely. And so part of it was like this was maybe 2 or 3 days before shelter in place, the official citywide order where everything was just, we couldn't leave our houses.
So this is like immediate, this is like March we're talking about.
Yeah. We had just done a big show with Danny and Kronos and the poets from Youth Speaks, an opera called Echoes. And this was like, that was the last show we all played.
Right.
It was very clear even then, like the day we'd had that show was the day that like Herbst closed and like Davies closed and like all the giant venues, and then it was clear that everything was going to close. So it was almost like a little bit of just, if we were to weaponize the tools at our disposal, it was a question of experimental music. Just like, is it possible for us to do a thing that will actually evoke calming or will actually can physically and emotionally make someone feel better? And what is it like if what we're doing starts from that premise? Like if we were weaponizing our tools for that end.
So Danny, Living Earth Show actually asked you for this.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as we're talking about all of this, you know, going back to sort of what you initially mentioned, Tim, about self-care, and like the word vulgar was thrown around, and I think like you know, I think about that like Bernstein quote, right, that gets like used over and over again about
right, which the Leonard Bernstein estate actually came out and said like, yeah, probably don't say that right now, because like that's not what he meant by that.
And like that's where, I mean, the thing that comes to mind, I'd be curious to hear y'all's thoughts.
Well, no, I obviously know that quote, but why not just for everyone else say what that quote is?
Yeah, do you remember?
Yeah, you go. It's like, this will be our reply to violence, to make music more intensely and more beautifully than ever before. Something along those lines. And it's always something that gets trotted out by
Oh yeah.
music field after like some sort of calamity or
Right.
yeah.
Oh, I have seen that quote. Yeah.
He said it apropos of
Mm-hmm.
the assassination of JFK.
Got it.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, like nowadays, it seems like a really easy free pass to like make music comfortably and like it seems like a call for inaction, basically.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Where like I think like what's really interesting, you know, I mean, like I think what we made is like really beautiful, and that was one of the you know, deep set goals of it, was to make something beautiful. But I think like beauty is only, I think beauty is extra powerful when it comes from a place of function and purpose. And so I think like as I've thought about it more, like the album in many ways is kind of, yeah, an experimental byproduct of this like practice, this like very personal, like you mentioned, Timo, like self-care practice, that we're sort of using ourselves to explore, and that like hopefully is useful for other people. Like hopefully this is the kind of thing, you know, and it's nothing new. Like these practices exist with many artists, you know, Paulina Oliveros and so many, right? But like this is sort of our little nook of exploration.
Right, and we should say that there's an actual document that you produced that is a score of sorts, sort of halfway between a score and a set of instructions, that, yes, it does contain sort of references to the Living Earth show instrumentation, but it also seems very flexible and very much doable by like people with other skills and other instruments. And I'm also curious about, just having looked through that score, the album kind of follows the score, but it's also different. Like it's a different piece, and you've clearly sort of taken some of these strategies, you call them, and put them together in different ways, combined some of them, you know, altered some of them in really interesting ways, and sort of made this version of what feels like a very satisfying album out of this document that is, you know, if you just followed it, would not maybe necessarily make something like that.
I'm curious.
Let's hear from Travis.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the process of making the record, which was all based around like these exercises that were all just on a PDF that we would share around, where it would have a drawing or some sort of graphic representation, and then there would be text instructions. And when we started, I got a little bit overwhelmed by the criteria that we would ask each other when we would record something of, is this calming? And like, you know, it felt really subjective to me, because I felt like it was calming for me, but I don't know if it could be used functionally as calming material for other people to listen to. So at least with the stuff that I was like throwing into it, because I didn't know what Andy was doing. I had no idea what Andy's stuff sounded like. So I just made the decision to do it as selfishly as I possibly could, where like I felt like if I was capturing a meditative state, or if I was in the proper headspace when I was interpreting whatever my instructions were, that then I was doing my job. Like, because I couldn't necessarily speak to calming, but like I could put myself in the right headspace by capturing first takes, doing my best to remember what the prompts were, like.
Right.
I didn't always.
Well, I mean, that leads me to another interesting element, is that like, obviously you and Andy have now more than 10 years of experience playing together. And in this case, you weren't exactly playing together. You were, you know, doing this socially distanced thing. But you obviously have like very strong ideas of like the kind of thing that each other do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I mean, what was that like to sort of put yourself in to try and imagine the other person, or did you try to do that?
Like I did, but I think it was like it was all out of intuition where, you know, like I would kind of have I know that I would do certain things because like I would try to, I would have a feeling about what Andy might do, and then I think that I would naturally choose like a complementary action on my instrument. But whenever I heard what Andy did, it wasn't what I thought he was going to do, but I still felt that it worked. And there were a couple moments like where I tried to imagine doing a project like this with Andy 10 years ago. Like say it was like the three of us like trying to make an album 10 years ago, and I think it would have been drastically different. I think that we would have had a lot more conversation about it instead of feeling it out like from a visceral place. But
What actually, yeah.
I would have rushed a
maybe
lot more.
Yeah.
Maybe this is a question for Danny. But what to what degree do you have any feelings about like planning in this case? Like to what degree are the musicians allowed to sort of like talk things out, like plan for certain you know, structural things to happen, or is it really just supposed to be like, you know, take it as it comes?
I mean, yeah, I guess I'd be curious to hear how this works in your creative process too, Timo. But you know, for me, the thing that makes this kind of project so exciting is that it relies on so many acts of like faith and synchronicity in the process itself. And so I think like for me, you know, the only element of planning that I think we really decided on was like, if I notated something, it was generally in one key. Like, I think that's all. I mean, and
it seems to be based around this sort of A major, E dominant kind of world. Yeah.
yeah, it just sits there because, I mean, in some ways as a strategy in itself of like, I don't know how these things are going to fit together, but if they're all in the same key, there's really likely that there's going to be some correspondences that feel true to me and what like this idea of calming means to me. And so it's a curatorial strategy in itself, but like really what makes it so fun is the material decides, like the sound, the actual sounds themselves decide what the final shape and thing looks like. And you know, it actually required very little discussion and like labor in itself. I mean, yeah, putting the sounds together, but yeah.
And then, sorry, you go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I think like this, it's interesting to think about this because it's part of, because like putting this together made me think a tremendous amount about the classical tradition and the relationship between a composer and a performer. And yeah, like I think like this came very naturally when like we were sort of receiving an instruction and had ideas of how to follow it. Like there's nothing I do just as a performer that won't be influenced by Travis, whether he's there or not, just because playing for so long, like that's just informs how I play percussion. But if Timo, you had asked us to do the same gesture, I think I would perform it extremely differently. Like we and Danny have like, you know, have many years of collaborative work together. And
that's true. Like I should say
so
that
like,
the pair of you, or the trio of you, also go back really far.
And so like, I think it's a little, sometimes when people talk about like text scores and instructions, it doesn't necessarily do justice to the work and intention behind it. Like Danny can give me a really simple sentence and that's instructions, but that's informed by a work practice that goes back many years. Like I know what it means when Danny says to repeat a gesture, or when he's exploring a sound, or like I would give him a, you know, we would exchange logic files that are just enormous of a bunch of different instruments in a bunch of different ways. But like there's an unspoken, unwritten practice there that is sort of essential to the process. Like I thought about whether or not something was calming a lot less as a performer. And that's just because like I guess like my role is kind of like in two places, right? Like as the person who as the commissioning agent, like we talked about this, but then once I'm in performer mode, I have 1,000% faith in Danny, so that when Danny gives me an instruction, I'm less concerned about whether or not it's a calming sound, because I know of Danny's work as a listener, a fan, and as a curator and commissioner.
Mm-hmm.
So like I would
this I mean, this doesn't seem to me to be like out of line with aesthetically with like other Danny Clay pieces that I know.
No, I mean, he wrote a percussion solo for me that was developed very similar. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to approach Danny at first, just because like this working in isolation would not feel like a compromise. Like I think our entire like, you know, Travis and I, just from the very beginning, when it was very clear what was like sort of the magnitude and gravity of what was happening, it was really important for us as an organization to not do anything that felt like a compromise. And I think that's possible for us in a way that it's not for a lot of other groups and organizations, just because we're more flexible. Like we can record at home in a way that feels like this wouldn't have been better in a studio, and it wouldn't have been better like together, and it wouldn't have been better like in so many, like this is the ideal realization of this project.
Yeah.
And it's a project that maybe was like born of a moment, but didn't, like the goal was to not have it feel tied to,
right. You're actually like using I mean, as artists, we're always sort of like working with constraints, whether those are imposed from the outside or imposed on oneself. And this seems to me to be a case of you really like using those constraints that we're all feeling to do something that was really, yeah, as you said, that didn't feel like a compromise.
Right. And also like I think for us, for me and Travis, when we commission, like our general, you know, way of operating is to give us the composers as few constraints as possible. Like do your most ambitious thing, whatever you want. It doesn't matter with the instrumentation or duration or like whatever whether we're like, you know, in a concert hall, or like you want us to do this in Sutro Baths, fine. Like whatever, or like on a boat or something, like we'll make it happen. And it's only after working with someone for a long time where we feel kind of comfortable enough to be like, hey, what if we do something where there are more constraints on what the project is and what the process is? Like, I mean, Timo, it's the same for you. Like, you know, For Elise couldn't be like, would never have been the first thing we did together. Like,
right.
like a thing like that can only come from like, you know, we know each other and know each other artistically, and like develop like it feels like you're part of the group and can be we can like share in the creative agency as well as the interpretive agency.
Exactly. And I mean, there's so much about that piece that's like, it's basically like an Andy Meyerson Twitter joke.
Which piece?
In like in music, my For Elise transcription, which
for those that might not know.
Yeah, it's part of an ongoing Living Earth show project, just sort of reimagine the classics. So
it's called The Living Earth Show Does the Symphony.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, which I think is I think could very well displace, you know, for example, like Leonard Bernstein's children's classics as sort of like the important album of childhood.
It's all we've ever wanted to be. Yeah.
Yeah. I had a sort of more, I guess, philosophical question about this piece, which is it obviously put me in a little bit of a Brian Eno headspace, you know, a composer who I really love, and I can tell you probably share some admiration for, who said of his kind of seminal ambient piece, Music for Airports, that it was because flying is something that is kind of so otherworldly in a way. It's such a like inhuman experience, and it's so like the risks of it are so obvious. It's like the risk of sort of like coming to grievous bodily injury or death, that he wanted to make something that didn't so much as, you know, make us forget about death, but kind of made us okay with the possibility of death, which I always think of as it's like such a interesting way for sort of ambient music to have formed, because it's become such a sort of dystopian idea of like canned music or elevator music, or just like music without any actual musical interest, or any philosophy behind, just sort of like cancellation of thought. And of course, I can't help but think, like, you know, the overarching feeling of this time, this lockdown and quarantine, is sort of a fear. You know, it's a fear that death is sort of happening outside and all around us, and like you're putting yourself at risk by, you know, stepping outside of your house or your apartment. And this felt to me as though maybe that was something that was on your mind a little bit, was like that idea of comfort or calm was sort of a way of coming to terms with the possibility of death.
I think I didn't like, I don't know if I came at it from like the existential angle as much as I did that I thought, when we were talking about the project initially, that it was an unavoidable touchstone when attempting to make a record of functional music, was the Eno record.
Mm-hmm.
But when I did go through it, just like on the nerdier side of things, like I did have like a setting on a Lexicon Reverb, which is supposed to have been like emulated after the Lexicon unit that was used on the piano on that record.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Which was that something that it sort of stretches the sound, or it stretches the reverb of the sound?
It was just like a digital space that had been used on a Lexicon 480L, and you know,
which is like a vintage delay unit.
Yeah, and so, I mean, that was my little inside joke.
So there is actually a little.
But like, I don't, you know, like either Andy or Danny, did you have like any thoughts like more similar to what Timo was talking about, just about like the corporal stuff, about fear for your bodies?
Yeah, I mean, how much time do we have? It's like, but yeah, I mean, you know, it's like, yeah, right. I mean, you really nailed it, Timo. I mean, these are just like, these are like both ambient and very prominent concerns, and even more immediate and urgent, you know, emergency concerns for like a lot of people living in the United States, right? Beyond the coronavirus, right? But especially including the coronavirus. I mean, the shortest and vaguest way that I can say that I've wrapped my brain around it, I guess, is that like I see it as a human duty to acknowledge and like, I'm trying to think how to put this. I'm going to edit this silence out.
Hell you will.
I mean, I just feel like as an artist and as a person, we need to acknowledge suffering in every facet of its existence. And I think it's also our duty, like as artists and people, to use every means at our disposal to alleviate that suffering, right? I mean, I guess that's as abstract, but also as like ultra direct as it can get.
And I mean, tell me if I'm going too far here, but I was kind of thinking like there's something about this idea of like settling on a dominant chord, which happens in a lot of the album, of this sort of E dominant space, which if you don't know that terminology, is basically just a way of saying it's like an unresolved chord. It's a chord that traditionally would resolve back to the home key. And in this case, you sort of settle on it, which is, you know, something that it has in common with certainly a lot of ambient music and a lot of minimal music. If you think about, you know, a piece like Steve Reich for organs, it's a sound that in Western music traditionally resolves, and you've sort of divorced it from that context and said like, no, we're going to sit in this unresolved space and we're going to come to terms with it, and we're actually going to sit with it for so long that it doesn't sound unresolved anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned you know, I guess I hadn't thought about it in terms of tonic dominant, but you're totally right. I'm going to have to listen to, I mean, because, you know, I've realized over the last few years that I'm fine with like 7 notes, more or less, you know, as tools for a lot of expressiveness. And like, I'm fine with like, you know, with tonic dominant I'm fine with like 4 chords, you know, and like,
yeah. Well, and the musical materials at use here are you know, very humble and very simple. But I am curious, like there are some moments where it feels like a sort of more authorship or more sort of like composerly intent takes place. I think it maybe in the 4th track that I'm thinking of, where it just feels like, oh, the way that the bass notes come in when they do, it's like, and then the way this sort of upward arpeggio that happens, that is echoed in both parts, just felt like so, I guess, kind of perfectly placed, that I was kind of like, oh, there was no way that was just an accident of improvisation. But maybe it was. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I mean, you know, it's about like, yeah, what collage is always about, finding those moments of serendipity and just like, you know, milking them for all they're worth, right? So a lot of it's more accidents than I would care to admit, but also, you know, if you nudge things in just the right way, it's like, you know, it's amazing how much richness of relationships and how things can seem to trigger other things. And it's just this like complicated network of relationships that just kind of exists to begin with.
Right, because our brains want to put all those sounds in relation to each other. I mean, especially if we're sort of, I don't know, maybe this is just my composer brain taking over, but as a composer, I'm always sort of thinking about like the events in the course of a piece in time in relation to each other, and sort of what happens when, why. And so in the context of improvised music or sort of chance music, it's always very interesting.
Right. Well, I think like, well, two things. I always thought, first of all, like that Steve Reich piece for organs should have been called Forgans, but also like, I think like
saves time.
But I think like, when I was performing this, so like the score I didn't view the score as much as a performance and more as like generating a really elaborate sample library. Like, so like the logic files that I would give for any one of the given strategies would be like 90 tracks, where I would track the same thing and do it a bunch of times and like create like, which is like insane when like like then sometimes I would like layer them over each other to see what happened, and it was insane. But like I didn't view it like I was performing a movement when I was doing one of the strategies. It was like, I'm going to give Danny like all of these like ideal Danny samples, like knowing what he wants and knowing how he works and knowing the sort of like toolbox that he works with. Like
that sounds like to me like a very Andy Meyerson strategy.
Okay, I gotta know. I gotta derail this thing again. So yeah, I did the opposite. Like, I don't know what it looked like when you like what you did to compose the things that you received like back from your prompts, Danny. But like, I tried to give you like as present of like a straight improvisation as I could muster, and that felt like how I wanted to fulfill the shared goal that we had.
Well,
and Andy took it like the other way, which is you know, typical. Typical, classic.
Travis, you also multi-tracked yourself singing in like 8 and 9 part harmony.
Well, that was an exception though, because like I got wild hair. You know?
That was beautiful, by the way. The close harmony stuff. Good intonation. Did you throw any melodyne on that or what?
No, I didn't. Like that one, I did not. I did when I did a jug version. So I did the same material with like a big growler glass jug.
Oh, okay.
And then
tuned it to different pitches.
Yeah, and then with then I did it the way that Andy described. I don't think that made the album, but like I think the one I just like kind of sang at my desk, and then the jug one was like touched to hell.
Well, let me so like I mean they were performances of those exercises, but I wasn't really thinking about, I was just like doing the task as best I could. It was feel like it was about presence, and like it was not just like sort of recording a really good cymbal hit. It was like recording this instruction in a way that I knew that Danny wanted, in a way that would be like useful to Danny. But I wasn't thinking about it as like a full like when I was sort of doing that on a sizzle cymbal or something, and sort of like repeating a gesture and then like rolling a gesture and then like breathing with a gesture or something. Like that wasn't like the piece. I never sort of imagined that like that would be a piece in and of itself. It was sort of like accomplish this task with as much presence and as much sort of like meditative, like
right, yeah, without concern for continuity, right? Is just but
yeah,
like
exactly.
You're thinking about it without thinking about it, and then like Danny, what was the process like when you kind of received like separate improvisations? Like, were you nudging?
I'm curious about this too. Yeah, like how did it all come together in these tracks, and in like how did you then like choose how to divide up the strategies, and in some cases sort of combine them, I think I heard. And yeah, I guess what was the sort of post compositional or like studio composition in a way?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to look back. I mean, I feel like it always starts with way too many. I was doing it in Pro Tools. It starts with way too many like Pro Tools files that get abandoned at some point, right? Like just because the first act is just like taking two things and listening to them at the same time without doing anything else. And I think like either those two things have this like, you know, this like chemical reaction between them, and make sense together, or they don't. And like, you know, with enough time and enough material, like you just find things that were meant to be together. Either they make sense in terms of how the pitches interact, or the textures, or, you know, just the general feeling. And it's just, you know, sort of like shaping and sculpting from that initial, you know, marriage of two, you know.
And can you imagine you know, other composers and performers and producers sort of getting together to make other versions of this album?
Definitely.
I
I mean, I
love
think
that so much.
yeah, this is something we've been talking about, and I mean, I think yeah, and I think this like score is not done either. I mean, I think this is something that continues to build, and like like a like a book of lesson plans or something. It just the more people that get involved in it, kind of make it their own and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, I just like I love what you said about how our brains are just like these associative machines that want to link things. And like I think if you have an idea, like even a line of text as a starting point, anyone that makes something with that in mind, like all of those sounds are instantly like connected in some way, right? And I feel like that's what's so exciting and useful about this kind of strategy.
Totally.
Yeah.
I also really don't want to, like, I'm of two minds, because one, I would love, like, it's so exciting to imagine any other performer or composer compiling this together. But there's also something really special about, in this specific piece, I don't want to diminish the composerly work you did. Because like, I was not like, say in the first part, I wasn't like waiting 45 seconds and then just like hitting the cymbal. Like there was a lot of composerly intent in how you compiled it in a way that like would look wildly different in anyone else's hands. And I'd be really excited to see what that would look like. But I'm also very excited with this as its own. This is a piece by Danny Clay that we performed.
This is in a way the Ortext edition.
Yeah, exactly.
But I mean, it's interesting what you said about like giving someone a line of text and having that be sort of a piece. And in a way, I think you can reduce most pieces down to a line of text. Most at least in sort of Western classical music, most pieces are much more scored in a much more detailed way. Right. But there's always going to be a gap between what the score says and what the performers have to do. And to hear that, you only need to like hear a computer do MIDI playback on a score and hear how like awful and wooden it sounds to realize that like there's like it's like the part of the iceberg that's underwater is like all these decisions that the performer is making. And in this case, it just seems to be a case of like you as a composer, like deciding to give slightly more responsibility to the performers and slightly like hand over a little bit more decision making than they would normally have. But that what results is in a way a pretty like I guess I would say like finished sounding piece.
Yeah, I mean, before I forget, I want to like keep a thread going of the one line of text that can describe every or many pieces in Western classical music. I want to know what these one line of text.
Right, it's right. Like summarize Mahler Third Symphony
yes.
in like a tweet.
I want the tweet length text scores for all of Western classical music history. But
I think it's a good exercise actually.
Yeah.
Is to be like, oh, what is what is like Sibelius Sixth Symphony doing, essentially, like when you like boil it down.
I'll need some time to wrap my brain around it.
So like, I mean, a lot of this like bringing this sort of back to this piece and this moment, one of the things that's like actually feels really good and important is it's sort of forcing an industry-wide reckoning with the question, what's the point? Like, why? Who cares? And like, as a field, that's a thing that's never like that is ignored a lot or sort of taken for granted as just a foundational question, like why, like who cares? And so anytime anyone kind of dialogues with that question, it's great. Like it leads to really good if uncomfortable places.
Yeah.
And so this piece was like, it's sort of like, it's a joke to like describe a symphony in a tweet, but it's also like being able to articulate the point of what one is doing as a work practice, as a field, as any individual work that's created. Like that's something that's really important as we're sort of like struggling to be like, okay, we can't perform live. We can't, our organization might not exist. Like what is the value of the thing that we do to ourselves, to the people that interact with it, to like a greater, like anything. And this was a piece and a project born of like our first like post-COVID like interaction with that question.
Right.
Like it's something that's been important to us foundationally for a long time. Like being able to, when we commission anything or curate anything, it's like what is the point? What is the like the research question that's being investigated? How can that like
right, finding something greater than an answer that is it's art fu.
Exactly.
And
Or like it's fun. It's fun. Yeah, exactly.
There's and just to like tie that back to what Timo had mentioned about the like composer performer relationship, right? Like I mean that's what like the idea that there is, and like there are answers in some ways. They're very small answers there, right? It's like there's this Miss Frizzle from the Magic School Bus.
Yeah.
Like she says, if you keep asking questions, you keep getting answers, and vice versa, right? Like, and the thing that I like about this way of working, like, I guess as a composer, for me, I have a really hard time saying like, I think this, which is like what a lot of, historically, a lot of composers kind of like their music is summed up in a way like, this is a thing that I'm thinking or feeling right now. And where a project like this and like a process like this is exciting is it's more like, I don't know, like, what do y'all think about it?
Well, it's sort of like, some pieces are hypotheses and some pieces are manifestos.
Yeah.
And I think I tend to prefer the hypotheses. Composers maybe a little bit more generally, but
well, that's actually it's an interesting question. How much of the agency is, or how much of the responsibility is it the composers to have the hypotheses or to generate it, or is that the responsibility of the person actually commissioning this piece or starting the process? Like a composer whose work practice is rooted in manifesto and working out an agenda, or like describing making a very clear point. I like as an ensemble that commissions a lot of pieces, and working with composers who think that way, who have answers and who are sort of saying something, that also feels like an act of experimental music, to engage them in a process and give them tools and see what happens. And that feels like that's sort of our job as an ensemble, right? Or as a presenting organization. I think like we're classical musicians, right? We play classical music. We play notated music. We came from conservatories, whatever. And the first few years of what we did was like, yeah, we'll play in this model and be a classical group that commissions music or whatever. And more we've stopped calling ourselves classical musicians and started calling ourselves experimental musicians, in that like our job is to generate those questions and activate composers and other artists and collaborators who we think could answer them in an interesting way, could like investigate those. Yeah.
So I guess in that case, and maybe this is a good note to close on, if this is an experimental work and you started out with a hypothesis, what were the results of the experiment? Like, did it succeed? How do you like? Do you feel calm? How do you feel?
By the way, the experiment succeeded because we did it, like, which is always the answer, right? Like there's never like it's never like sort of goal based. It's like explore that question. And so
yeah, like
that's the process, Timo.
I guess I'm too results oriented or something.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, so I'm curious what everyone else's answer to this is, but like as a performer and an interpreter, it's my job to not think about the answer once I start playing. Like my job is to sort of be blank and to perform and be the interpreter of whatever happens. And so like the fact that something is created means it was a successful experiment. Like something was generated. And like the question was not like, we need to make something calming. It's like, what happens when we start with this as a foundational question? And anything, like if something happens, then it's a successful experiment. It did its job of exploring this question. It wasn't like, yes or no, can we be a calming force in the world? It's like, what happens when that's the generative idea?
Right. I feel like, I mean, it's not ultimately the impact is, not up to us to decide or declare, right? I mean, I think at least in terms of, I feel like, you in many ways you are what you make. And I feel like what we made was like a very, came from the deepest places that we were coming from in the last few months, and probed that truly. And like, I hope that, I hope that these things are useful and make, again, like help alleviate suffering in some capacity. I would consider it a success if like somebody that's not me felt that way. And either way, it leads to more. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, either way, it leads this leads to more iterations by us and other people that hopefully continue that mission or whatever, and like, continue to find new paths for it, which is cool.
Well, I think it will, and I think it's a beautiful album. Beautifully played, beautifully recorded, beautifully composed and arranged. Music for Hard Times by Danny Clay on the Living Earth Show. And if you haven't, pick up a copy, and everyone should listen to it.